State. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. I am here today with one of my co-hosts, Cam. What's good? Good? All right, so today we are doing a myth that I will explain later, I was not as quick to want to do because I didn't know anything. But the myth is African wildlife conservation. So a quick explanation is our guest will explain much better than us. But quick explanation is like the idea that there's these wildlife animals in Africa that need to be saved and conserve, and just biodiversity in general throughout Africa and really throughout a lot of the global South. But we're focusing on Africa today, and that needs to be conserved. Because there's these poachers, people who are going to hunt the animals and kill them. So we need to preserve these lands. That's like a very generalist sense of what they say is supposed to happen. But this really isn't happening. What's really happening is just a continuation of colonialism. And they use the sweet animals and the elephants and the lions and all these really innocent animals to they use it as a front. Really, they as in capital, as in the West, as in all of those things. They use it as a front really to just further invade and conquer more land. And Africans get dislocated, get displaced, they get killed. A lot of these conservation companies militarize the local population as park rangers. Most of these conservation and safaris and parks are not owned by Africans. They're owned by the same people who colonize them or just corporations in general. And they just use the local states as kind of a front to do their business. So I admit, when I first was sent information on this, I was like, I don't know anything about African wildlife. And I really never looked that deeply into it. So I didn't even know there was a myth there, to be honest with you. I just know when I went to Africa, I was not interested in going to safaris because I was not interested in this kind of like Lion King experience. So I didn't really deal. But Cam, you've been to Africa too. You can speak to. I know you like animals more than I do.
I actually was cool. I was quite the opposite because I'm pretty anti-zoo in the United States. I think that there's no way that a penguin should be in Texas right now. It's 100 degrees outside. So for me, like the thought that there was land that was put to the side so that animals could be able to roam free in their natural habitat has always been something like it's actually been on my bucket list. I remember looking at pictures of Giraffe Manor just a couple months ago and thinking how that would be such a beautiful experience. While also not challenging my own thinking of who's running these, what is the benefit, who is at risk of harm in order for these conservations to be functional. And, I really am grateful for our guest today who was able to shine light. And that's not to say that there isn't a purpose and a need for wildlife conservation, but it's also really imperative for us to constantly analyze who's benefiting from this, what are the risks to the indigenous populations, and like ultimately what hand does colonialism have in this, which we learned while doing this research that it has just as tight of a grip on Africa as it does everywhere else, and that shit's lame. So I'm excited to dive into this interview.
Yeah, so just a few other things people think about. If you've ever seen the white guy that went into Africa to hunt down animals so he could show them on screen and get as close as they could.
G'day and welcome to the Dark Continent. This is one of the most feared snakes on the face of the earth. This is the Black Mamba. We're going to take a look at the deadliest snakes of Africa. Cobra.
I was always happy when one of them got killed, but because they brought that on themselves. But anyway, I don't know if I'll keep that in. But I was saying, like, the white dude always went to Africa and was trying to, we need to protect these animals, and they use it to raise money and stuff. So yeah, we have a guest today who could break this down, as I said earlier, much better than us. Her name is Dr. Aby Sène, and she recently wrote an article in Africa as a Country that really chronicles a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to bring her on now.
Hey.
Hey, I enjoyed listening to that. You two talking, because both of you sort of represent, these two, the broad spectrum around wildlife conservation in Africa, right? And how people feel about it. You either don't like it at all, because it's something that most, at least for Black people and Africans too, is, people that only think that, okay, that's just things that white people do, but
that would be me.
Right? Yeah, trust me, I've encountered a lot of people like you, Black. Or you have Cam, that's actually on the other side of the spectrum, but doesn't really understand how conservation works, right? But are very much anti-zoo, right? That's also something that that's very typical of the other end of the spectrum too. So yeah, I'm Dr. Aby Sène Harper, or Aby Sène simply. I'm a faculty of conservation, social science within the Parks and Conservation Area Management program at Clemson University. And a lot of the work that I do, both in the United States and in Africa, is looking at cultural landscape in general and looking at conservation issues. In Africa, particularly, when I look at conservation issues, I look at it at the intersection of livelihoods, protected area governance, and also tourism management within these spaces and conservation. So how does, a lot of the questions that I ask that sort of animates some of my, research is to see how conservation development can be, or rural development in Africa can be sort of mutually reinforcing, right? That's how I started at first, because like Cam, I was very much interested in protecting wildlife, right? But I also had a vested interest in seeing rural development happen, right? Because I knew, being from Africa, I knew of the impacts of conservation on rural communities, right? So I was in a train wagon, the bandwagon of, oh, let's make conservation and development come together. But then that opened up an entire can of worm over the years. And I was like, this is not good. So here I am today. I've written a couple of op-eds with the encouragement of others who have written op-eds. Before, all of my work was mostly in academic journals. And I found that these op-eds have actually had a much broader reach.
Yep.
In academic journals. I'm like, why have I not been doing this before, including in, Africa as a country and foreign policy. So those are the two main ones, and hoping to write more so I can reach a much broader audience as well and really shine light on some of these issues. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
So
thanks for being
absolutely.
with us. And I want to make sure we
Sure.
reference the name of that piece, Land Grabs and Conservation Propaganda. That's the name I said earlier, there was a piece in Africa is a Country. That's the name of the website. But the piece is called Land Grabs and Conservation Propaganda.
Yeah, and there's the one on foreign policy too that is a bit longer, and that one is called Western Nonprofit are trampling over African rights and land.
Was that based on the same piece? Was it like a longer
It's not.
version?
It's a longer version, and the focus is much more on like the actual shining a light on the NGOs rather than looking at conservation broadly.
Okay.
Looking at the propaganda. The one in the foreign policy goes a lot deeper into these, capitalistic interests.
Okay, we'll definitely link that as well.
Yeah.
So as we were talking about at the beginning, most of us don't really have much deep thoughts on conservation. Again, even my not wanting to go to safari was, like you said, mainly this is just only my reference point was just like the white people that want to be around elephants, and I don't want to be around any of them, so I didn't want anything to do with
Doesn't
that.
even like regular animals. So.
Yeah, so, but I had no sense of it being like this really like larger sense of colonialism. That was really just kind of I think you said something about that in piece, how colonialism sometimes just gets reduced to the researcher or even someone like that white guy that's on National Geographic, but we don't really understand the structure of it all. We just have like maybe a cultural reference, and that's pretty much all I had. I didn't have like a big sense of it. So for those who don't know like anything about conservation at all, particularly in wildlife conservation in Africa, what is African wildlife conservation, and what purpose is it proclaimed to serve? Like, so what's it supposed to be? I guess we're really trying to understand here beyond or before we really get into what it really is. Like, what is the front essentially?
Yeah, I mean, it's simply that, right? When we think about conservation, you think about protection, right? And African wildlife conservation, or just wildlife conservation broadly, whether it's in Africa and mostly in the global South, right? A lot of those target, and that's not by accident, right?
Mm-hmm.
For wildlife, and we don't, it's just way too big to think about it now in terms of the global South, but we're going to talk about Africa, right? So wildlife conservation is just that you're looking to protect wildlife and its natural habitat, right? And so, but that, however, the face, you talked about the white guy, you talked about these people cuddling, these white women cuddling gorillas, like Jane Goodall, for example. When you think about, wildlife conservation, particularly in Africa, what comes to mind is mostly these white conservationists that we've seen on TV, right? Like Steve Irwin, for example, the guy from the Australian guy, who's a reptile guy, like all of these shows. And then you have Jane Goodall, you have Dian Fossey. I don't know if you guys remember Dian Fossey in the 80s.
We leave civilization behind us and go into the heartland of the mountains. To build a nest may take up to 5 minutes.
She died now. She was actually killed by Africans who retaliated. And, I used to feel sorry. Now I'm like, oh no, she's crazy. She needed to go. I'm like, yeah, okay. No, these people are crazy. So anyway, so Dian Fossey ended up, but like, it's funny because it's after they died that these biographies come out of them. And you're like, oh my goodness, like these people are crazy, right? It's like a cult. Anyway, so you have Chris Williams. It's mostly white. It's like a very, very white, field, right? So, and I was probably for so long, the only Black person, the only African within these spaces, right? And that's not by accident, right? Because conservation biology in general, the field of conservation was founded on eugenics, including in the United States, right? And white supremacy, like pretty much all sciences, but I'm not going to spend much time on that at this point, but if we have time and interest, we can talk about it, right? But what's important for people to understand, right, is that even though it's dominated by white people, right, they didn't invent the notion of conservation in Africa, right? And I'll clarify in a little bit. The notion of conservation as protection of wildlife and its natural habitat was inherent to African indigenous ways of life, just like, indigenous people everywhere, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in the United States, in New Zealand, all settler colonial places, right? Indigenous people actually saw themselves as inherently tied or an extension to their natural environment. And so they built in practices that actually preserve wildlife, right? So, but the difference between Western model of fortress conservation, as we call it now, or militarized conservation. There's so many names to it now, right? I'll call it white people conservation, right? The difference between white people conservation and indigenous African conservation are in their processes, right? And the belief system upon which they're founded. And there have two major points of departure, or I would even say conflicts, right? So white conservationists don't see humans and nature as inherently tied, right? They see them as separate. Right. And that's why now we have protected areas, right? They're saying, oh, these Africans or these indigenous people are spoiling the environment. They can't, coexist because humans are inherently bad. And we see it even today when when we talk about the climate movement, the ecological crisis, we're always like, oh, humans are so bad. Which humans? So that's very much this separation between humans and nature, and that's where their conservation come from, right? Versus Africans' view of nature, and humans are inherently tied, and that's why they have cohabited with wildlife for a long time. They understand wildlife, and I'll talk about the Maasai community in a little bit, because they're really right now epitomizes, right, this fortress conservation model as it's unfolding, right? The Maasai people, who are very symbolic of, the indigenous resistance against conservation, have always coexisted till today with wildlife. They understand, for example, the migration patterns of the wildebeest in the Serengeti and a lot of these conservation areas. So they move their livestock based on these migration patterns. Right? They have built in their livelihoods to actually reinforce, they're mutually reinforcing. They understand wildlife migration patterns. They understand what we call biological rest. We understand what they understand mating seasons. And so a lot of their livelihood practices are sort of formed around this, right? It's a symbiosis, right? And, but then and that's one thing, right? That human and nature connection, right? Some see it as separate. White people see it separately. That's why we have protected areas and national parks. Africans, indigenous people in general, see them as inherently tied, right? And their livelihoods are adapted based on that. And the other point of divergence or conflicts is that white people focus so much on single species conservation. The elephant, the rhino, oh, we have to save the elephant, we have to save the rhino.
Endangered species, extinction.
Right, endangered, it's so narrowly focused. It's so narrowly focused. It's like, oh my God. And what's, and what is dangerous about that is that it simplifies the narrative, and it's an easy, BS to sell, right? You tell a white person today, I mean, think about the WWF. What is their logo? The World Wildlife Fund. It's the panda, right? They choose very specifically these very cuddly animals to basically mobilize public concern, right? And also increase funds. There's a lot of money that goes into conservation NGOs, but that's like a whole nother thing. Right. And so they're so focused on single species conservation, megafauna conservation, right? That again, it simplifies the narrative. It's an easy sell, right? And it's basically fulfilling their childhood fantasies, right? They don't have their livelihood tied to this wildlife. Their livelihoods are not tied to this land like Africans, right? So what they do, all they care is about the wildlife, to the point where they value wildlife more than value African lives.
It's a giant vacation home for them.
It is, right? I mean, let me tell you something. Okay, that actually reminds me. A lot of these people, I had an NSF, a National Science Foundation fellowship that's paid for my PhD studies, and that helped me fund my studies. But a lot of these wildlife conservationists that I was with, most of them were white, come from very, very wealthy background, right? Like at least the ones that are very, either their parents were conservation biologists themselves, or, they're actually either from the upper or middle class, right? But they go to the wilderness of Africa and have these like, go native with indigenous people there, save the elephants and all of that. So it's like a childhood fantasy for them, right? That's how they see wildlife conservation, right? Versus Africa, on the other side, Africans see it more broadly. I shouldn't even just say Africans. This is like indigenous people in general. That's why we call them, most indigenous people, who are environmentalists, we call them land and water protectors, right? Like land and water protectors, because they preserve ecosystem. Their notion of conservation is to preserve ecosystems that sustains, that gives and sustain lives for both people and wildlife, right? And so that's really a major point of convergence. Unfortunately, people that get funded the most are the ones that look at, that are focused on single species conservation, right? How can we save the rhino? How can we save the elephant? And to me, it's not so much that they don't deserve to be saved. I mean, I love elephants. I love megafauna too, but it places our focus on the wrong issue. It's very dangerous. It misplaces all of our focus on like these charismatic fauna, to the point that you're actually even, and they've actually also been criticized by their fellow scientists, saying that, this focus on saving what we call the African big five, the elephants, the rhino, the wildebeest, the Cape buffalo, and there's a fifth one, I think it's the leopard. Oh, the lion. Oh my God, how did I forget the lion, right? Like the focus on saving these big five just because, it tickles your heart or whatever. It's really giving sort of a, how do you call it? It's at to the disadvantage of other less charismatic wildlife, right? That actually play a much more important role in the ecosystem, right? It's neglected the preservation of other less iconic, like the butterfly, for example, or even insects and all of that other stuff that actually support, that play a much more important role in the ecosystem than these megafauna.
So in one capacity, you talk about like, there is a need as a whole to ensure that we are maintaining traditional like and indigenous practices, right? Of what we take from the earth, we're giving back, that we're ensuring that what we do is not going to essentially wipe out entire species, which from what you're saying and from the work that we've read from you, like that isn't even what the trajectory that folks are on in Africa at all. Yet the narrative that has been painted historically is that these animals are being killed off, that these animals, that Africa needs to be saved once again, reclaiming that narrative. And that has led to these conservation efforts that are essentially taking land. So like, can you express like, how are these conservations actually functioning? Like who was over them? How is the process of building them out actually taking place?
Yeah. And so I like that you talked about, Cam, you said, the need to save Africans, right? The need to save African wildlife. And so that's getting, like a sense of urgency, like it's their white people's duty, again, to save African wildlife, just like they're saying they need educating the African to take care of their wildlife, right? Like, so one thing I do, and I'm gonna give you it to me, wilderness, the idea of wilderness is really the grease that's, again, greasing this like colonial ideological apparatus, right? That continues to have these atrocities of wildlife conservation happen without anybody even thinking, you know what I mean? Like being critical of it, right? And the ideology of wilderness, I always compare that to the manifest destiny, right? I mean, what was you guys know, right? The function of the manifest destiny, the idea of wilderness, actually, if you think about it, wilderness, the ideology of wilderness started with the westward expansion in the United States, right? when European explorers first came to the United States and started expanding westward, they became enamored with like the landscape of America, right? Which, by the way, the indigenous people have preserved, right?
Yeah, and they
Also,
felt it was their God-given right.
right, it was
No.
there.
Similar, it's
Absolutely.
also similar to White Man's Burden, Manifest Destiny, all of those kind of traits.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you know, and Manifest Destiny, right? Both Manifest Destiny and the ideology of wilderness are rooted in Christianity, right? Wilderness is like a lot of these explorers sort of were looking for to preserve the Garden of Eden. Like if you look at there's a lot of their writings of what they call them the transcendentalist way back in the Romanticist era. People, you know, when naturalists were visiting the not visiting, they're actually exploring to colonize and kill
Conquering,
indigenous.
yeah.
Right, to conquer, basically conquer, right? A lot of them were also naturalists. A lot of them were natural scientists. They were writing and describing of the American landscape as like something that was pure to God, you know, pristine, and we needed to preserve, and you know, without even knowing, I mean, completely ignoring the role that indigenous people within the settler colonial America had actually played in shaping the landscape, right? Through like agricultural practices. I mean, this is not like, it's not pristine, right? Wilderness, the idea of wilderness is a social construction, right? That serves the same function as the Manifest Destiny, where they want to preserve, it's our God-given right to preserve.
Of course, we're always ignoring what indigenous folks have always done.
Exactly, and that's the same thing that's happening now absolutely in Africa, right? With the same thing with like, oh my God, we need to preserve African landscape. Oh my God, we need to preserve, it's our right, it's our moral duty to save African wildlife. It's our moral duty to save, you know, they're always standing on this moral high ground. Like if you see these videos of Jane Goodall and, you know, David Attenborough, by the way, they're all racist. We can talk about them too later, but people rarely talk about their racism, right? Like all of these things, you know, it's like a manifest destiny. It's almost like you are giving a reason to invade.
Yeah,
for imperial expansion.
Yeah, you say like how, and then they utilize propaganda to convince others in the global West that this is necessary in order to get the funds to start this. You say like, but the propaganda machine in the capitalistic core has convinced its population that the poor African and their exploding population are the major drivers of wildlife extinction. That if the poor African, just merely disgruntled by the crop-raiding elephants roaming their villages, also benefited from this, and they'd be more motivated to protect wildlife. And I think that when I read that, it made me think back to like the videos that often leak into the media of, a village was raided by elephants, or, you know, wildebeest were taking out crops and things like that as a mission to push conservation, while also not actually showcasing videos and interviews of people in these areas who have stated two things. One, because of development that's taking place in other spaces, it's pushing animals into these spaces. And two, that for many folks, they understand that this is just a part of life, and a part of that work is to rebuild and to continue on. And so like, I thought that kind of what made me think of like, dang, like what messages and what propaganda have I, as somebody who typically tries to analyze these things, have I absorbed in also recognizing, being like, dang, well, if they had more space, then they wouldn't be doing this, when in reality, it's but folks have always worked in harmony within the spaces to begin with. These messages that like make it even worse.
Absolutely. And no, you absolutely, Cam, I think, you know, and that's, you know, with these op-ed too, you can't really elaborate. So I tried to jam pack everything, you know, every aspect in that one paragraph, because it's just so absurd. Like, it's so absurd, right? That, and this is what, and it's funding, conservation is funding, including my colleagues who I'm very good friends with till today, right, are getting fellowship upon fellowship, so much money funded into their dissertation research to continuously theorize about how can we empower the African to save Africa, to save their wildlife all the time, right? And so, and then what they're doing is like everything, including myself, I'm not going to leave myself out, right? Like a lot of my work way back in the days was looking at community-based conservation models, right? But I was so focused on the community. How can we empower? Like, what are the social norms within this community that is preventing conservation from happening? Why are conservation and development projects, right? These projects that come in that are focused on ecotourism, why aren't they delivering development or positive outcomes both for conservation and growth development? I mean, I was asking all these questions, right? But then I like when you talk about, like, think about displacement, think about all of these other issues that are so much broader, right? Like and I don't know if you guys heard my interview with Tiffany Cross on MSNBC about a week ago, right? She wanted to talk about human-wildlife interaction. Mm-hmm. And she was so focused on poaching, like her hypothesis or her theory or her idea, and I shouldn't just say, hey, right, her by herself, right? It's just the American public in general, right? Mainstream, right? They always think about poaching as the sole, oh, elephants are aggressive because of
poaching. Just, I don't know if we actually said what poaching is. Poaching is what? Just for people who,
okay, so,
who don't know anything.
All right, let me backtrack a little bit, right? So poaching is actually the illegal, and I'm very intentional to put this in quote, right? It's the illegal use of wildlife resources, whether you kill, whether you're taking it, whatever it is. But now it's been, for all Africans, right? But now it's been, because of this narrative of anti-poaching and elephant and rhino, every time people think about poaching now, they're associated with ivory poaching, they're associated with rhino poaching, but poaching can actually be, if I went to the forest, right, and kill, say, an antelope, which is the equivalent of a deer, right, a white-tailed deer. They're everywhere, which, by the way, it's actually regulated. White-tailed deer hunting in the United States is regulated, and it's very legal, and people use.
I was just going to bring that up, actually. I was going to ask because, in the U.S., while there are regulations on hunting, right? So like you can't, there are times of the year where it is encouraged to hunt specific species in order to keep a balance, essentially, of the ecosystem, to not have overpopulation coming into the like suburban areas. And then there are times of the year where you are not allowed to hunt or fish or things like that, so that way nature can return to itself. And so that's interesting, that because of the narrative that is being spewed and the propaganda that's constantly fueled about poaching, that even regular traditional hunting and fishing that indigenous folks are partaking in is now, they're being criminalized for this.
Yeah, they are, basically. I mean, poaching is just a criminalization of
survival.
Of survival. That's it. Literally. Thank you. I was going to say food security, right? Because a lot of for you have to think that these landscapes that are being put aside for conservation happen in areas that are isolated from most of them are in areas that are isolated from the main city or the main market. So what they call it bushmeat. That's how they label it, right? Like the game meat, by the way, it's like bushmeat is basically it's game meat, right? I hate that they call it bushmeat, but that's what they use it. When Africans go out to kill for food, they call it bushmeat. I don't know if you guys have heard the term before or not.
I've never heard bushmeat. I've heard game meat, which even game is an interesting way of labeling it.
Well, game meat, they call it game meat in the United States, but they call it bushmeat in Africa, right? But whatever, that's a whole nother, we can talk about semantics and discourses another time. It's going to take way too long. But anyway, so a lot of these are disconnected from the main, these communities are disconnected from the main market, right? And a lot of these are subsistence hunters. So they depend on antelope, they depend on game meat as their only source of protein. Same thing for fisheries, where I did my research in Senegal, right? The conservation area is mostly along the Senegal River delta, right? And it's mainly for fishing. So having a conservation area there is basically cutting access to fishery resources. So a fisherman can go fish in a park and they'll call it poaching, right? But the only thing, so poaching can be anything, from basically killing a lizard inside the park, right, to killing an elephant. But now it's become, because of these like discourses around anti-poaching, everyone associate poaching with elephants. Everyone associate poaching with the rhinos, right? All of these big
The animals that are in the movies, that
exactly,
or
yeah, like the Lion King.
yeah.
And so when we talk about, and like in your work, when you talk about how essentially conservation is still continuing to push colonialism, we talked first about like land being taken, and so like and now people being criminalized. Can we just like expand on like what is happening when there's land is being acquired for conservation? Like what happens to the indigenous people that live on the land, and then how does this play on semantics of changing it from hunting and fishing to completely poaching? Then like what are the actual consequences for the people that are trying to just feed themselves in the traditional sense?
Absolutely. Listen, I'm glad you asked that question, because I would encourage anyone right now to, if you're interested in this, to look at the plight of the Maasai community right now, right? Even though they're the classic indigenous, when we talk about conservation, it's the classic model. They've really fought tooth and nail, everything, every fiber of their being against the conservation mafia. But what is happening right now with the Maasai community is basically what happens all the time when a new land is acquired for conservation, right? I said acquired, it's basically land theft. So this is what happens, right? Basically, and I kid you not, this happens a lot. You had someone, and I mean, I'm trying to really, I'm simplifying the narrative here, but that's how absurd it can be sometimes, where you have this white person, right? America, most of the time, other times from Britain, grew up watching The Lion King, wants to save the lions in the African wilderness, get a scholarship or whatever, their parents to fund their studies. They go to Africa and then, start setting up NGOs, Save the Lion NGOs and all of these things, or Save the Elephant NGOs. And then they start getting much more powerful to the point where this happens a lot, right? They start with a narrow sets of interests from these like mostly white conservationists, right? So they start lobbying the government, the local government, to put aside land for conservation, right? And money talks. A lot of these, they have so much pull. These conservation NGOs have so much pull because of how much funding they get, donors funding. To the point where, for example, a lot of time African governments have no choice because of these, they're getting aid or not.
It's neo-colonial. Yes, neo-colonial.
Right, exactly. Right. They impose like the IMF, the IMF and the World Bank will impose a set of conditions. If you want us to give you another loan, you're gonna have to do XYZ for conservation. Basically this kind of thing. And so you're basically coerced into setting aside land for conservation, right? And it all started with that one person who came to lobby people, like the Jane Goodall, for example. Jane Goodall, she's also a really great example of how she's actually royalty. She's British royalty. I'm not lying. She's actually a duchess or countess. I don't even know, but she's part of she's part of the British, whatever, criminals. She went to the Congo, I think, or Rwanda, right, and started working with chimpanzees. She fell in love with them. Then she started lobbying. Of course, she has a lot of pull because she's with the British colonial, whatever, criminals, right? So what they decided to do, of course, is set aside land for gorillas and chimpanzees conservation, but then they're actually literally, I mean, evicting the indigenous people that actually lived on that land. They displace them, and they don't, and these indigenous people are not saying, oh, okay, I guess if you give me tourism or if you give me a little bit, like they're not dumb. They know what's going to happen. They're not going to sit there like they make you think, oh, these, the locals needed a job anyway because of the way of life. They're tired of hunting, blah blah blah, so they wanted money, right? That's what they tell us, but that's not what happens. They literally evict them. You have a military, they have park rangers that show up in your house and then uproot you. If you don't comply, they'll torture you. I mean, the list goes on and on. Torture, rape, killings, I mean, murders, all of it, you name it. That's how they get evicted from their land. I mean, you've seen the WWF report that I sent you, right? Like,
yeah, they waterboarded people.
They
They were involved in gun sales. They were involved in murder. Yeah, so
but
so
they
I
keep
guess this
that to distract you from these crimes.
Just to understand on a more ground level. So the conservation, and correct me, I'm trying to see if I can get a picture.
No.
The conservation outlets, whether that be NGOs, parks, whatever, work in tandem with the puppet governments essentially to evict the indigenous people from their land. Is that it? Okay.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, they
and it's either you're down with the cause or we force it upon you.
Exactly.
And tourism is a lot of the global South has relied on tourism of people from the West. So tourism is a big aspect. I'm just saying also for the listeners. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but tourism is like a major form of revenue for countries that are already often starved. And I want to say this also for all these people that obsess over traveling while Black in America. But
my God, traveling while Black, and then all of these. No, I probably shouldn't say it. But
hey, you're in a safe space. Yeah.
We offend all.
But like these outdoor Afro, I mean, don't get me wrong, I laud their their goal to get more Black people outdoors, right? But I'm talking about these like Black-led expeditions in Africa that go to Mount Kilimanjaro, it's basically, honestly, these expeditions, whether they're Black or white, wherever they're coming from, to me is like white explorers going to America, when they came to America to explore the landscape so they can go back and advocate, for more conservation funding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, we visited Mount Kilimanjaro. This area is beautiful. Oh my God, there are all kinds of wildlife, but right now it's a threat, it's under threat by development, it's under threat. Like they'll name the indigenous people that are there having like millions of babies and like clearing out land for agricultural production. We need to set it aside and designate it as protected area.
Yeah.
And I think go ahead.
And I think that's important to know, because that's not to say that folks should not step outside of their homes and go somewhere, right? That you shouldn't.
Right.
Things. I think about like my experience in Cape Town and how, thankfully, I was taken by a local who lived in a township, but there were full-fledged tours that were led by white folks that were taking white people to post-apartheid townships that are filled with poverty and folks living in deplorable conditions. And instead of people walking, and I would listen to people and as they're coming back, they're like, oh my God, these poor Africans, like the conditions that they live in are horrible. And it was giving like feed the children energy, instead of actually criticizing it and saying, I just came from my cushy hotel in Cape Town, paid money, not to the locals, but to expats who are funding and running this to make money to go to a township, and instead of leaving that and actually challenging those conditions and actually saying that the true wealth disparity that I'm seeing is upsetting, it is unacceptable, and something needs to be done about that. Instead, you're continuing this narrative that Africa needs to be saved instead of colonialism needs to be destroyed. And that for me was just was insane, because it's like, even if you were to go and you're like, you know, I would love to see wildlife in their natural habitat, which can be a beautiful thing, being a beautiful experience. But if you're not willing to also challenge that notion of saying that, and I think that's what your work did for me, right? It had me really sitting here saying that in one capacity, it is not problematic that we want to put space aside. We have national parks in the United States. We have space here, but we're not also taking 66% of the global continent to do so.
Yeah,
it's
exactly. And
here to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, even in the United States, these national parks were indigenous, they're stolen indigenous land. The same process that happened to establish Yellowstone National Parks and all of America's favorite, whatever they call it, America's
Central
best
Park.
Central Park. I mean,
on a graveyard.
I mean, the entire country is basically, you know, it's like stolen land, right? Like it's hard to escape it, right? But I'm saying, you know, even national park, that 13%, I talked about it in the United States, and I don't want to diminish the plight of indigenous people in the United States that actually are still working to reclaim that land, by the way, right? There's a active land back movement within the national park systems, right, by indigenous people. And it's not to diminish their plight, but it's just to sort of get people to understand that even though these model of conservation, these protected areas model of conservation were popularized by Americans, like, think about it for a moment. If they think it was so effective, why in the world are they not trying to expand protected areas in the United States? By the way, actually, let me say that they are, but they're also stealing, you know, a lot of Black farmers' land. But that's a whole nother issue, right? Like the Nature Conservancy, you know, it's like this, the process is the same. But I'm saying, you know, it's by far, if you're so concerned about wildlife in general, which they say, you know, oh, I'm a wildlife, I'm an animal lover, but you don't give a damn about the deer that's being hit on every glorious day in America. You have a
every day. I pass one
every day.
I pass one all the time. Yeah.
But then you're getting, you know, you have armadillo. I mean, I can't stand being like, I still can't stand being seeing roadkill. It's just one of those, I close my eyes to get, that's just how. But it has me thinking, you have a deer killed every day, hit by a car. You have armadillo hit by a car. But then in Africa, you're getting what? Riled up over an African hunting game meat, like dick meat and antelope. You know, it's the same. Like, so to me, it's almost like, it's not so much that it's their love of wildlife. It's a combination of their love for wildlife, but also their anti-African, you know, like anti-Black racism, period. So, and it's that toxic mix that really frames a lot of these conservation, how do you call it, agenda. It's, you know, racial capitalism, whatever you call it, it's white supremacism, everything in between. And it's the same here too, you know, and I don't want to go off tangent, but even in the United States, you know, conservation easement, which they call, which are just trying to buy up more land for conservation, are happening predominantly in Black communities, right, that have taken care of the land. But that's another thing.
I wanted to quote something. This isn't in the direct notes, but you said, because I just want to get the actual companies on record, so people don't just make a vague kind of they reference, like we're saying these are places that can be named. So you say, while there are many local and well-intentioned conservation NGOs, weak internal structures, lack of financial support leave them heavily dependent on the support of the largest NGOs. And NGOs are non-governmental organizations, for those who don't know. Um, transnational conservation is dominated by mostly 5 international NGOs. So I just want to stop there saying like all of this is dominated by 5 companies. From the global north, with combined assets equal to the gross national product of many African countries, and have strong ties to extractive industries and finance institutions. A quick look at the leadership team of the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, and African Parks, who owned by a Dutch person, will show you a full panel of CEOs, billionaires, investment bankers from financial institutions such as Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, and the Blackstone Group. You said perhaps most disturbing of all is that West Bush, the chairman at Conservation International, once served as a CEO of Northrop Grumman Corporation, one of the world's largest weapon manufacturers and military technology providers.
Yep.
So if you just want to respond to that part, I just want to get that on record.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes. Listen, all of this. So what I was trying to say, and it's not hard to find. You just go online, look at their chair, their board of trustees or the chair, whatever, and you see them, and then you look up the names. It will tell you who they're associated with, and there are 5. Again, I want to insist there's some well-intentioned NGOs, right? Conservation NGOs that we really should be supporting and giving more money to, right? Unfortunately, these 5 that you have named, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, WWF, which most of us know, I think, with the panda, even Greenpeace, Greenpeace too is very problematic, but I didn't list it there. And like all African parks really dominate the propaganda machine, right? To the point where the majority of the donations go to these 5 NGOs, right? So it's stifling resources from these smaller and more well-intentioned, conservation NGOs. It stifles resources to the point where they have no choice but be absorbed into these larger NGOs, right? So, and then all of these 5 international NGOs are literally led by Western financiers like Goldman and Sachs, Merrill Lynch, the Blackstone Group. If you guys haven't, don't know who the Blackstone Group is, please, I urge you to look at them. They're like, and then even weapons manufacturer, right? And then you wonder why, they're all capitalists. Like they're all the ones that actually lead or act, even though they're not, say, the CEO of these conservation NGOs, a lot of these conservation NGOs as CEOs are trained biologists, they're actually scientists who actually have worked on the ground. But the board of trustees, the chairman, people who are actually funding their money is mostly all from extractive Western capitalists, all of them, right? Western financiers. And they're actually the same ones, just really quickly, especially, I think it's either Goldman Sachs or Merrill Lynch. I don't want to misquote anyway, they're all the same, are actually responsible for some of the largest land grabs, not even for conservation, but for agricultural production in Africa. Sorry, go ahead, Cam.
No. It was actually based off what you said. So just even in thinking of like when we talk about the ways in which this is problematic, right? When listening to the laundry list of companies and organizations that are stealing land, when you think of like what stake would Goldman Sachs have in this land, right? What stake would Lockheed Martin, would
Merrill Lynch,
have, right? And so when we think about like, especially when I think of Northrop Grumman, like that is one of the largest weapons companies.
It is, and I think they're sitting on the board of, I can't remember, either CI, anyway, one of those ones. That
Conservation International. That's
yes. I mean,
so
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
When I think about like what purpose would that serve, right? When we also talked about like some of the downside of this, because the people that are living in these areas when they're stolen don't just disappear.
They
And
don't.
so when we
Oh,
talk about how like Africans don't actually own these conservations, but that doesn't mean that they're not then employed. So like, what are the
yeah.
connections, the ways in which some of these companies are then making money at the hands
Yep.
of the locals?
And thank you so much for like, pulling back my focus to that, because the crux of my argument is now the way conservation, international conservation, and by conservation, I mean like, in Africa predominantly, but it's the same even in Asia, the issues are the same, right? The way conservation is today, it predominantly, by setting aside land for conservation, is predominantly has a function of primitive accumulation, right? To accumulate land and to also extract labor, right? And so that's it. I mean, African labor, and then I always tell, and this is not even I had to literally, this is actually an argument that has been made by other political economists that are looking at, we call them political ecologists, rather, not, that are actually looking conservation within these larger political economic structures, right? So, and those ones draw on much longer historical processes that actually even predate Yellowstone, right? They're looking at what we call like game laws. Have you guys heard of game laws in Great Britain?
I heard about them studying for this. I knew nothing
Oh, did you?
prior.
Yeah. So, yeah, right. So game laws basically it was in the 1830s, right? It actually restricted the peasantry. It took away their hunting rights for subsistence, right? So by taking away people's subsistence right or whatever to survive, you're basically inserting them into a cash economy, right? A capitalist system, right?
Market.
Like,
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. So game laws have actually played a pivotal role in thrusting Great Britain into a capitalist model, from feudalism to capitalism. I mean, there's a whole thesis on that, right? And that's what has been applied at the dawn of colonialism in Africa. Before even they established the first national park, they implemented the game laws. Same thing in the United States on Native Americans to restrict their hunting rights because they're depending on hunting for their subsistence economy, right? So when you restrict that, you're transforming them into laborers to extract their labor, right? And so,
And that sorry to interrupt, but that transition from feudalism to capitalism, I think that's an important point, because that's what you're trying to do, is you're kicking people out of their prior habitat, which wasn't that great, particularly in Europe, but you're kicking people out of their prior habitat, and then you're trying to send them into the labor force.
Exactly. Absolutely. So not only are you telling them you can't hunt these in these, I'm taking away your land and I'm taking away your right to hunt for subsistence, to feed yourself and your family. I mean, what are you going to do in exchange? Why don't you come work for me? Right? And that's the same thing.
People.
Exactly. And it's the same thing in Africa, right? The only thing, even today, and that has continued, game laws have been applied. People always talk about Yellowstone as the first big, thing that set in motion, in motion the spread of conservation throughout the colonized world. I go as far back as the game laws to really even understand it from this global capitalistic structure, right? Or even the expansion of imperialism, right? And so, so today, the same thing applies, right? That, let me just read back what I had written in the past, just to make sure I don't miss anything. It says, the same system later was deployed in much of the colonized world. I'm talking about the game laws, as Great Britain became an imperial power, especially in Africa, right? And so game laws in Africa became a modality of primitive accumulation. So the same thing that happened that forced the system from feudalism to capitalism happened in Africa. Same thing, right? Like, you cut out traditional hunters, now they're forced to work for you, right? So game laws became the dominant form of property relations in which the interests of capital and the interests of the bourgeois class that went trophy hunting coincided, right? Because I mean, trophy hunting was also a sign of like nobility, right? So it was a social arrangement in which the bourgeoisie could enjoy the prestige of hunting while the capitalists could profit from the labor of people who were forbidden to hunt as a means of subsistence, right? So fast forward in Africa today, right? This has always happened in Africa, but let's look at it today and how more complex it's become, right? Is that the same applies today in Africa, but adding on top of the capitalists and the bourgeois class, who they call, who are the trophy hunters today. That's why, by the way, you see every time you think about the Trump kids, right? Have you ever seen the Trump kids picture of killing the elephants?
Yes,
You've not seen it? Yeah, they're big trophy hunters, right? The Trumps are big trophy hunters. But anyway, most trophy hunters
That's
in
not
America
surprising.
At all.
Right, but these are the right. So you add the capitalists to the capitalists and the bourgeois class, right? You actually add the wildlife lovers, right? The Cam and I, right? People who are really in it to save wildlife, right? Right, and so you add that to this to the mix, and so conservation in Africa right now has become like this social arrangement in which wildlife lovers or conservationists get to enjoy the African landscape and preserving the fauna, right? The trophy hunting continue to hunt while the capitalists who run this conservation NGO can profit from the land because they've now been dispossessed, right? And also the labor of Africans to basically occupy a menial position in their, like these eco-lodge safari packages. That's why most of these Africans are like tour guides. If you go I don't know, where did you ever go safari hunting, Cam? I mean, not safari hunting.
I don't hunt at all. But no, I didn't get a chance to go. And now I'm kind of glad that if I do ever get the chance to go, I will.
It's okay.
In a far healthy. It's gonna take a lot more research for me to find a way.
Right, exactly. I was gonna say it's not that it's bad to go. You just have to understand the plight of the people, right? Like a lot of these. One of my friends came back from Kenya and he was all excited. Oh my God, they're giving the Maasai people. Our tour guide was a Maasai, and I was like, oh my God, like. A lot of these indigenous people are actually tour guides because they know the landscape. They can spot animals. I mean, they've lived in this landscape forever. So if a white tourist comes in and say, I want to see the African big five. And by the way, they're so fascinated with seeing them that they're literally putting the wildlife at risk themselves, right? When I went on a safari at Kruger National Park, it was for research, by the way, which was a wild experience. But anyway, I went to we spotted a lion on a hunt. Within 10 seconds, you had like 20 safari trucks and whatever surrounding the lion, to the point where the lion was just like, what the hell was going on here? It's like you're putting wildlife at danger. It's, you're completely changing their behaviors to the point where they become more aggressive even towards people because they're invading their space. But
I see videos on TikTok all the time of when you're driving through to feed them, and then fucked around, and now somebody's getting smacked by a zebra, or now everybody's because there's a cheetah on top of your Jeep and you're freaking out and like, oh my God. But it's like
literally like
it's like Jurassic Park or something. Yeah, which Jurassic Park is interesting. I never thought about that connection, but even though they're talking about dinosaurs and like it still has the same kind of mindset.
Yeah.
Let's create a park, because it is literally a park, and then let's play with it. No, I'm just saying, like, let's play with these animals and they become property. It's just it's more advanced, and in a way it's worse because they brought them back from the dead.
That is so right. I mean, I'm glad that you talk about Jurassic Park because it's part of our media, of our acculturation, right? Like we absorb these images of like, you know, land that has been set aside. Think about the Lion King, for example. You don't see one person in the Lion, like not one African in the Lion King, but yet it's supposed to happen on African land.
It's a really
Same,
overrated movie anyway. But yeah,
right.
To go back to a point you made, right? We've talked about like what in a utopian manner what conservation is supposed to be, and we know
Yeah,
that it's not, and how in
right.
reality it is just another form of colonialism. We talked about how, you know, most of the folks who are owning this are large corporations, are individual
Yeah,
white stockholders from the West, how people are being displaced. But you were just touching on how in the same breath then they're being employed to
yeah,
either have to
exactly.
work this land, or you touched on the Maasai people, which made me think, right? Very few indigenous groups get to actually stay on their land,
Yes,
and
very
for
few.
those that do, they're then exploited. And so
Yeah,
I think so often how, you know, the Maasai, thank God, like that the work that they get to do and the ways that they get to keep some aspect of their lives normal are
yeah,
also being exploited every single day, because they have to now allow others to come in. And
yeah,
outside
absolutely.
of that, what other ways has this become really damaging for those who are either working there, or how are they working, and those who do get to still live on the land?
Absolutely. So here's the thing, right? Like with the, and I'm gonna tell, before I answer that question, I think it's important to emphasize the point that the sheer spatial scale at which that land is absorbed and the amount of labor that's also being absorbed, right? Right now, the Maasai community, 80,000 Maasai at this very moment are facing eviction, right? And they're looking to absorb, I don't know how many hectares and hectares of land. So conservation to me is so freaking alarming in its primitive accumulation function because of the pace, right? And the amount of spatial scale at which it does it. Imagine 80,000 displaced Maasai people, right? That are later going to be working in the tourism industry, either as tour guides or, you know, or if they're being allowed to stay on their land, then they're forced to commodify their culture, right? So they tell you, this is what they tell you, to go back to your question, Cam, is that yes, sometimes they make provisions and say, you know what, we're not going to evict you. However, right, we're going to tell you that you can't hunt at, you know, they're going to put so many restrictions on their livelihood, you know, their livelihood strategies or the livelihood practices, to the point where you say, you know what, fuck it, right? Like, why am I even, you know, it's like hell. They create a hell zone. And also, not only that, but you're constantly running into anti-poaching units, right? Where, let's say,
And who's working these anti-poaching unit? Like the white people that bought the space?
yeah, I mean, no, basically, I mean, it's become a whole business. It's
Who are
become a whole,
who are the employees of those anti-poaching units?
so they tell you, this is what they, a lot of time they recruit locals and then
Mm-hmm.
train them to become their foot soldiers in their like so-called war on
And
wildlife.
that's how you get WWF, like
Right,
waterboarding
exactly.
and
All of these park
yeah.
rangers, by the way, are actually locals, but they're not.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, let me not say that. Locals, in a sense, as in they're nationals. They leave. They're, you know, like let's say the park rangers. I'm gonna give you an example with Senegal, but it's like that with everyone, right? Park rangers in Senegal are Senegalese people, right? That's what I mean by locals. But a lot of times they're not park rangers that are recruited to work on certain park are not from that community.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? And there's also a lot of like inter-community, inter-ethnic, you know, sort of, you know, conflicts that already exist. So take, for example, people are very marginalized. And that's one thing I always tell people, people who are mostly targeted for conservation, for protected areas, whose land are being stolen, are the indigenous people, you know, who are mostly marginalized, already marginalized in their own country, right? They're marginalized because of their, what they call their backward way of living. They're not fitting into the colonial model, this new, they're not modern anymore and they need to be modernized, blah, blah, blah. But yet it's that, ironically, it's that backward way of living that's preserved these landscapes from which they're now being evicted, right? And so, yes, those people that are recruited, that become park rangers are nationals, but they're not, more often they're not from those communities.
They're not
And so
indigenous
it
to those.
becomes easier.
They're not
Yeah,
indigenous to those areas, basically.
exactly. They're
Yeah.
not indigenous to those areas, right? Like the park I worked at in Senegal, for example, one of the biggest demand that they had for me when I was listening to them is we want our sons to be the park rangers. They should be the one, like stored in this landscape. They should be the one to be park rangers. Why are they recruiting people from outside the community? Right. But there's a reason for it. It becomes, you cut the ties so that torture can become they can be more easily apprehended. Right. But because they're not from that community, but also because these are communities that are already marginalized, right? Because they're quote unquote just backward. I mean, I heard it so much in this community in Senegal. Oh, these people are they're backward. Like they're fishermen, who fishes anymore, blah, 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 And so it becomes easier. They become an easy target even for park rangers who are nationals already. So they're already, they're preying on these inter-ethnic, differences already. That's what conservation NGOs do.
I think it's interesting. This isn't a perfect analogy. There's actually a lot of holes in it, but I do think there are some connections. I think about one, we were talking about the Travel While Black thing, and just this push for diversity, whatever that means, across much of the NGO world, not just in conservation, but in all nonprofit kind of sectors, and even in corporate America and in the Western corporate world. So they think if they can identify, they as in these entities, if they can identify Black people or people of color or whatever, that they'll naturally just be a fit for whatever they're trying to recruit them for. And Cam knows this very well because she's in teaching. Like it doesn't hold up like that. so
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's true. I like that you say that, Black, because a lot of times they say, because that's not what they're selling on their website. If you look at these anti-poaching, I wish I had found one to show you now. But if you look at their anti-poaching things, for example, website, it always say, we empower, the local Africans, or we turn the old poacher into a park guard. You know what I mean? Like you hear that so much, right? It's to give that front that they're rehabilitating Africans, basically. It's like a rehabilitation program. It's the same one with this thing on their war on drugs, right? To take the old addict and become the spokesperson.
Become the police officer.
Yeah, you turn him into a cop.
Yeah.
And this is, it has all the ingredients of colonialism, everything. And now you just made me think of one, right? To use locals as the police people, right? The slave catcher for, all of this. They're basically using the locals as their foot soldiers, but the locals are not the one who basically own the capital. They're no longer the one who own the land. They lose what really matters, right? Which is land ownership, which indigenous people have said time and again. I don't care about your tourism. I don't care if I profit from conservation. I want my land back.
Right? Home.
Exactly. And so even though they're recruiting them, oh, look, they become tour guides, you see it all the time. Then you have the white scientist and like the local guy that like put on together this environmental education program to sell you this narrative about how Africans have now.
The director of the conservation is a white man.
Exactly. It's like
who learns from a book about what's happening versus the actual indigenous people who had lived on this land who could have actually told you what's happening.
Exactly.
Or even going back to those who are hired to be the anti-poachers are now being told like, well, you don't have, this is the only job option you have. And
That's
then
it. That's it.
and
That's it.
it's to persecute your own people, or for those that you said were brought in from other areas, even more so a level of disconnect, because you don't know them as a person.
Yeah.
You don't know what
Exactly. And so it's easy to torture.
And then when I thought that was an interesting point, because you wrote about how the anti-poaching units are then highly trained and militarized in giving weapons, which is ironic
Yes.
that like Northrop
Yes.
Grumman would be on the board, because who's supplying these weapons for the anti-poaching units?
Yes.
And going
now
back
you're
to
getting somewhere. This is
and then
my
going back to
point.
semantics of recognizing that poaching is not what propaganda has pushed us to believe as just, saving the rhinos or the elephants or the lions from being skinned, but also now anybody who is trying to provide for themselves, whether that's fishing,
Exactly.
whether that is agriculturally taking berries, taking corn, taking grain, or anything, as well as
Absolutely.
traditional hunting is now being criminalized, being assaulted. We talked about that in the article you sent us. You sent us that WWF article that talked about somebody who was just merely accused, who was beaten and tortured. And when folks in the village actually were telling reporters about this and trying to file grievances with the WWF, that the very poachers that they hired and trained had illegally kidnapped somebody, essentially, tortured them for days on end, ultimately killing him off, instead of actually caring about changing policy.
Exactly. I mean, it's the same.
They lobbied to cover it up. And that itself just shows that like it isn't about saving or protecting animals. It's not about protecting people. It's about protecting their assets and their stock.
It is. Absolutely. It's protecting capital. That's it. It's literally, and their capital is basically what African, like, they can even kill a rodent. They'll be criminalized for it, right? They're going to be thrown in jail. And pastoralists in Africa have been the most impacted because of, their transhuman society, where they move around with their herds, right? So they cover large regions, but protected areas alone, like, think about in Senegal, the largest national park is almost 1 million hectares of land that's been set aside. And people think that these lands were empty of people before. Come on, 1 million hectare, And so imagine just 1 million hectare in the United States being put aside to say nobody can live here, you can't fish here, whatever, right?
All right, that is part one. Shout out to Dr. Aby Sène for coming through. Part two, we're going to get deeper into a lot of the things we already discussed. So we're going to open up going deeper into the colonialism aspect of it and how it really mirrors what we know historically to be colonialism, like step by step. We get more into the violence and militarization of the park rangers, comparing some of the experiences of Africans on the continent with Africans here in the United States, and the ways that the policing actually has some similarities that we just kind of pull from conversation, and some other things, that you can wait to hear. But as I said at the beginning of the episode, this was not something that I was into or something that was on my radar. So like many things on this show, it's nice to learn about stuff that I didn't know much about, right? So always appreciate that. Never want to feel like I'm the expert of anything, and I think my co-hosts feel the same. So definitely check that out. For those who are supporting the show, want to definitely recommend that you support the Patreon if you are not already. We just started a series on films like Black Myths, Black Movies. It's a much more kickback than even our show is. It's not as scientific, but it's a pretty interesting conversation. We just did one on Barbershop, not a good film, but we picked scenes from movies, Black movies, and we identify the myths that exist within Black movies. So just like with myths in general, if you're interested in making any recommendations, please send those in. People who are patrons who will get priority in that sense. And we'll be posting probably about half of those discussions on Black Power Media. So right now, the one on the Barbershop, about half of that is up. So Sorry we didn't shout out the patrons today. We will do that for the next episode. Just a little bit behind here, but I definitely want to say thank you to everybody who's supporting. And peace out, and we'll see y'all next week.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe.